How India quietly outmaneuvered everyone at the global summit. Imagine this. A room full of the most powerful leaders on Earth sat expecting the exact same familiar outcome as always. The United States would set the agenda, and every other nation would carefully fall into its expected place. Europe would nod in coordinated agreement and add its polished endorsements to whatever the Americans had decided behind closed doors. China would push and maneuver and position itself as the only credible rival power worth taking seriously at that table. Russia would demand attention and remind the room it still held enough weight to be heard and respected by all. And India, large, complex, developing, still climbing, would be expected to listen politely and sign where it was told. That was the script, and that was how every major global summit had played out for several decades without any deviation. Every analyst had modeled it, and every diplomat had predicted it, and every television expert had written their post-summit analysis in advance. But something happened inside that summit hall that none of those analysts or diplomats or television experts had remotely prepared for. India played a completely different game, a quiet game, a patient game, and an almost invisible game to all outside observers. And when the summit ended and the final communiqué was read aloud to the assembled world's press, jaws dropped everywhere. India had not simply participated in the summit the way the world expected a developing nation to participate in such forums. India had shaped the entire outcome from the very inside of the process without anyone seeing it happen in real time. Without firing a single diplomatic shot in public, and without making a single threat, and without raising its voice even once, India had outmaneuvered every major power in the room, and most of them did not even realize it had happened yet. The Western media scrambled desperately for an explanation, and think tanks published emergency briefings through the night trying to catch up completely. Former ambassadors went on television and tried to retro-engineer exactly what India had done and precisely when it had been done. And slowly, piece by piece, the real story began to emerge, a story years in the making, invisible to nearly everyone watching. To understand how India pulled this off, you have to go back much further than the summit itself and its dramatic conclusion. You have to understand the position India had been building silently and systematically in the years and months that came long before. And you have to understand why India's particular position in global geopolitics gave it leverage no other nation in the room could replicate. For most of the 20th century, India operated in global forums from a position of obvious and acknowledged economic weakness worldwide. It was a large country and a loud voice, but it lacked the economic muscle to truly compel any major power to listen. America could ignore India, and Europe could politely sideline India, and China could condescend to India while smiling warmly in all public settings. And India's diplomatic wins, while real and sometimes significant, were always limited by this fundamental and inescapable economic reality on the ground. But that reality had been quietly and dramatically changing for several years before anyone in the Western press fully acknowledged it at all. India had become the fifth largest economy on Earth, overtaking the United Kingdom, the very nation that had once colonized and ruled it. India had become the most populous country in all of human history, crossing 1.4 billion people and surpassing China at the very top.
India had built one of the world's fastest-growing middle classes, a consumer market that every major global corporation desperately needed to access. India had launched its own space missions, its own global payment infrastructure, and its own advanced defense manufacturing programs, all moving forward simultaneously. And critically, India had spent the years before the summit building something even more powerful than economic growth or military capability alone: It had built genuine and trusted relationships on every single side of every major global divide existing in the fractured modern world. While the United States and China were locked in a deepening and increasingly bitter strategic competition with no visible end in sight, India was quietly sitting down to dinner with both of them and carefully pouring tea for everyone at the table with equal warmth. While Europe was trying to isolate Russia after the war in Ukraine began breaking apart every existing diplomatic channel between them completely, India was still buying Russian oil at a discount, keeping its own economy strong and refusing to condemn Moscow in any single UN vote. While the global South was growing visibly frustrated with Western institutions that repeatedly promised reform and then repeatedly delivered absolutely nothing at all, India was speaking directly to those deep frustrations and positioning itself as the clear leading voice of the world's developing and rising nations. This was the real architecture behind what happened at the summit. Years of patient, deliberate, masterfully executed global diplomatic positioning by New Delhi. India did not arrive at the summit to make friends with one side or to make obvious enemies of the other side at all. India arrived at the summit as the one country every single bloc needed, every delegation wanted, and no one could afford to lose. And that position, earned quietly and built slowly over many patient years, gave India leverage that no other nation in the room possessed. The summit itself was called to address several of the most urgent and genuinely dangerous crises the entire world was simultaneously facing together. The global economy was under severe and compounding strain that no single nation had the independent power to resolve on its own terms. Climate commitments made with great fanfare in previous years were falling apart in real time as political will evaporated under domestic pressure everywhere. The war in Ukraine had fractured the international order in ways even the most pessimistic strategic analysts had not fully anticipated beforehand. And the question of how to reform global financial institutions to better serve developing nations had reached a genuinely combustible and breaking point now. Every one of those four crises had a clear fault line running straight through the middle of the assembled nations in that hall. On one side sat the wealthy, powerful, historically dominant nations, the G7 and their allies and their aligned global institutions worldwide. On the other side sat the rising, frustrated, long underserved nations of the global South, Africa, Asia, Latin America, and the Middle East. Those two sides had been talking past each other for years in increasingly empty and unproductive forums, and everyone in that room knew it. And right there, sitting perfectly and strategically at the exact intersection of those two worlds, was the quietly confident Indian delegation. India's external affairs minister had arrived 2 full days before the summit formally opened to the assembled world leaders and their delegations, not to attend the usual dinners and press conferences and performative rituals of pre-summit diplomatic theater that all the other delegations were performing, but to hold a precise and carefully structured series of quiet bilateral conversations with delegations from every single major bloc in the building.
The Indian team met with the American delegation and spoke the language of strategic partnership, technology sharing, and deep defense cooperation with genuine warmth. The Indian team met with European ministers and spoke the language of climate investment, green energy, and sustainable development with real credibility. The Indian team met with African delegations and spoke the language of solidarity, historical connection, and the urgent and genuine need for funded debt relief. The Indian team met with Gulf nations and spoke the language of energy security, trade corridors, and deepening economic interdependence and long-term mutual benefit. And in each of those carefully arranged meetings, India brought something that almost no other delegation in the entire building could honestly claim to offer. It brought a genuine and credible existing relationship with the other side, the very side each of those delegations most distrusted and most feared. America trusted India enough to share sensitive intelligence and maintain deep strategic channels between the two governments across many established frameworks already in place. Russia trusted India enough to sell it advanced weapons systems and maintain strong economic ties even as the rest of the world imposed heavy sanctions. China respected India enough to negotiate directly face-to-face, even during periods of genuine and serious bilateral military tension along their long shared border. The global South trusted India because India had never once colonized, exploited, or quietly abandoned any of them when real international pressure came down hard. This was India's genuinely hidden and most powerful card at this summit. Not military power or financial leverage or manufactured diplomatic ultimatums from a position of strength, but something far rarer and far more strategically valuable in the dangerous and deeply fractured world that existed inside that summit building at that precise moment. Genuine, multi-directional, historically grounded trust, and the complete strategic freedom that only real and widely distributed trust can ever give a single nation at a table like this. And India played that rare and powerful card with a precision and patience that left every other delegation disoriented and ultimately outpositioned in the final outcome entirely. The first real test came on the climate finance agenda, where wealthy and developing nations had been completely deadlocked for years without any resolution at all. The G7 wanted the communiqué to include binding language holding developing nations to specific emission reduction timelines and clearly defined measurable targets going forward. The G77, the large coalition of developing countries, wanted firm and funded financial commitments from wealthy nations before agreeing to any new obligations whatsoever. Both positions were described by their own delegations as completely non-negotiable, and every previous summit had simply deferred the issue to the next one. India stepped quietly into that dangerous and seemingly unbridgeable gap, not with a compromise written in advance and ready to be immediately handed out to everyone, but with a new framework that skillfully and deliberately reframed the entire conversation away from the locked positions that had paralyzed all progress for years. India proposed language that directly linked climate financing to technology transfer on terms that developing nations could actually afford to implement in the real world. It was not the language either side had come into the summit demanding loudly and publicly from their very first moments inside the building at all. But it was carefully worded language that both sides could honestly and genuinely live with when they sat down privately and examined it with fresh eyes. And because India had spent 2 full days quietly and patiently building real trust with every key delegation before the formal sessions even began, the both G7 and G77 were willing to accept a framework from New Delhi that they would have flatly rejected if it came from anyone else. That single quiet diplomatic move unlocked an entire section of the communiqué that had been completely frozen for 3 consecutive years of failed, empty summits. But that was only the first chapter of what India had silently engineered before the television cameras ever turned on in the hall at all. The second test was far more dangerous and far more consequential for the entire international order that had governed the world for many long decades. It was the question of the war in Ukraine and how the summit communiqué would describe the conflict and assign responsibility for its continuation. The United States and Europe wanted strong and unambiguous language condemning Russian aggression directly and calling for immediate and unconditional withdrawal from Ukrainian territory now. Russia and its few remaining allies wanted that language blocked entirely or softened beyond any recognizable meaning to the point of complete and total uselessness. And China, watching carefully and calculating precisely, was playing its own quiet but transparent game of strategic ambiguity on the entire question throughout. For 3 full days of formal sessions, that single paragraph in the communique text had consumed the entire diplomatic energy of the summit completely and exclusively. Every proposed formulation was rejected by one side before the ink had even dried on the preliminary draft, circulating nervously through the delegations. And the entire summit was slowly beginning to drift toward the outcome everyone feared most, a final statement with no real substance or meaning at all. And then India made its second and most audacious diplomatic move of the entire summit, the one nobody in the room had remotely seen coming. India proposed separating the humanitarian consequences of the conflict from the political and legal question of direct responsibility and attribution of blame entirely and deliberately. The communique would speak with full force and complete clarity about the devastating human cost, the food security crisis, and the energy disruption caused by the war. But it would use carefully constructed language on political responsibility that each major bloc could interpret through its own established legal and moral framework independently. It was not a perfect solution, and every experienced diplomat in the room privately acknowledged that uncomfortable fact, with varying degrees of visible diplomatic discomfort. But it was a functional solution, one that allowed the summit to produce a real, substantive, signed communique instead of a collapsed and meaningless one. The Americans were not fully satisfied, but they accepted it because India had privately guaranteed its continued and very public support for Ukraine's full sovereignty. The Europeans were not fully satisfied, but accepted it because India had committed to specific and measurable humanitarian contributions on the ground in the conflict zone. Russia would have preferred no language at all, but accepted the formulation because the alternative was complete diplomatic isolation from everyone sitting at the table. And China accepted it because it slowly realized that India had somehow produced an outcome that Beijing itself had completely failed to engineer, despite trying far harder. What happened in the room in the quiet moments after that formulation was accepted, one by every major delegation gathered there, was something that seasoned diplomats who had attended dozens of global summits described afterward as genuinely unlike anything they had witnessed in many long years. The delegations that had arrived as rivals and adversaries were all looking across the table at the Indian delegation with precisely the same quiet expression. Not anger and not resentment, and not the calculated political coldness that is the usual default setting of professional global diplomacy at the highest level. Something far closer to genuine involuntary respect, the rare, unmistakable kind that only ever arrives when you watch a nation do the genuinely difficult and make the world finally notice.